This is, let me say hello quickly. I'm David. Jordan. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you. Thank you for coming, huh?
Good morning. I'm Mike Zafrowski, and welcome to the Church of the Holy Spirit for our Faith and Work Ministry. We have a nice small group here in person and a much larger group watching live stream and Zoom. But this is the 131st session of Faith at Work, as we discussed earlier this morning, David. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce a great leader and a great friend, David Evangelista. David, welcome to Lake Forest.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Before introducing David, as we normally do, we'll start with a prayer. Father Luke.
Let us pray. This is a prayer for all special souls. O Creator of Olympic heights and beatitude depths, you gave your precious child, Jesus, to open our hearts on earth. Despite suffering, he was raised for our attention and admiration, that we might realize the true glory of gracious power. Gracious power made most obvious in the mightiest efforts of the humblest souls. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for the faith and work of David Evangelista, and for your tenacious love for each and every soul. Amen.
Thank you, Father Luke. I was just told that my microphone is off for the intro, so I will not go through all of it. But again, welcome to the Church of the Holy Spirit. For our 131st speaker, David Evangelista. David, as you know, we normally cover three broad topics: the speaker's background, a life story, if you will. Second, very important, the speaker's faith journey and any epiphanies. And last and most important, how does the person bring faith to work? So those are three. We've had speakers from all walks of life: executives, not-for-profit leaders, homemakers, chief medical officers, just released prisoner, professors, university presidents. But one thing in common is that God does his work through many people in many professions. Every person that comes here is at a different stage of a faith journey. And like what you told me this morning, they look at the preparation for this session, and one of the most important things they've ever done. And I know you've spoken at so many great conferences, major universities, and I know you were somewhat both excited and nervous. I can assure you, all the previous speakers have been a really gift to all of us.
Thank you.
And I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Hopefully you've seen David's resume. So I'll just cover a few things. But this is a person of huge character, drive, ambition, in putting people first. So you'll be able to see that over the next 55 minutes or so. He's the president and managing director of Special Olympics Europe and Eurasia, and also responsible for international development for Special Olympics. But just really quick summary of what that means. He is responsible for 58 countries across Europe and Asia, driving the movement. And also as a senior advisor for international development, he works with some of the biggest corporations, not-for-profits, clubs, to really provide the funding for the organization and the volunteers. Among the two reasons he came to Chicago was to be here for our session, but also spend all day yesterday with Lions Club International, a major partner who's given tens of millions of funding for them over the last decade or so. We have Rick Young back there, who is a very big supporter and an active member of the Lions Club. David has given speeches at virtually every major university. He speaks often on CNN, Bloomberg, ESPN about the movement. He is very significant driving on human dignity, inclusiveness for all individuals, and very specifically with individuals with intellectual disabilities. He's a number of our not-for-profit organizations on their boards. Without going through all those details, I mean, he went to a college in American University in Washington, D.C., and his business degree is from the University of UAE in Vigo, Spain. David lives in Vigo, Spain with the love of his life, Carmen, and their two boys, John and Paul. So with much more ado, let's welcome David to the Faith at Work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell us, where did you grow up? And tell us about your childhood.
So let me just start by saying, Mike, this is what a remarkable experience. I mean, I've spoken to many, many settings. This is definitively a first and by far the most unique. So thank you on behalf of not only the movement of Special Olympics, but also my family, who you just mentioned. A big thank you. I grew up in a small town in New England called Johnston, Rhode Island, from part of a very deep Italo-American culture. I grew up with family being, very core to everything we did. I grew up speaking, English at home, of course, because we were American. I loved Charles Barkley. I loved Michael Jordan. I was a big Michael Jackson fan. So I'm, American as they come. I try, and I try not to hurt myself doing it. But and I grew up with a lot of Neapolitan dialect in the house, and I remember, as a child in some of my earliest years, I remember the feeling I would have when I'd walk into my grandparents' house, both my father's side of the family and my mother's side of the family. Whenever you'd walk into your grandparents' house for a holiday, whether it was Christmas or Easter or whatever it would be, there was this kind of energy, which I'll get to it, as we go further into it. But that energy was something that it grew. And it built upon itself in my life. And I remember some of the biggest things when I was a kid, when we gather around the table, and of course now we're Italians, so the table is essentially the altar. I mean, it's food. It's food. I mean, it really is. I remember, my grandfather on my mother's side, his name was Dominic DiConti. He was may he rest in peace. He was a veteran. He fought in D-Day. The original landing, and I remember he would always bless the table with a palm that he would get from St. Robert Bellarmine, our church in Johnston, Rhode Island, and he would bless the table with the water. And as a child, I was restless. I'm still restless, but I remember it was those moments were when I was most at peace, because I knew that what he was doing was something beyond us. That act was beyond us. And I want to get to that a little bit as we get into this discussion. I had a great childhood. I was terrible at baseball. I was better at basketball, but not so much better. I loved reading. I was a regular American child, running around with kids in the neighborhood, doing my homework, summer reading, trying to stay out of trouble. I will say, my childhood changed a bit when my folks divorced, and that had a profound impact on the way I saw the world and the way potentially the world saw me. But I have to say, one of the best decisions I made was a decision I didn't want to make. And I was 9 years old, and my mom and dad, what's that word? I forgot the term, but when you basically are forced to volunteer. I know there's a term for that. But they asked me to be an altar boy. They said, David, you should be an altar boy. And I didn't know what that meant, and it seemed pretty formal. You had to wear stuff, and you had to show up, and and you had to you had to follow direction. And of course, now here I'm a 9-year-old kid running around. You know, my dream is to be either Bo Jackson or Michael Jordan, and now I'm, you know, I'm in a church. And as I look back and as I enter today, Mike, and as I was saying to Father Luke, being an altar boy set me on a course that I could never have scripted. And I don't know if my mom and dad understood what they were really doing beyond trying to teach their son discipline, to teach their son responsibility, teach their son the ability to follow instruction, namely to be quiet. I mean, to be honest. And so I had a wonderful childhood, and it was a childhood that church was a big part of that childhood. And I think more than anything, family and Jesus were core to my earliest years. I went to CCD, I went to catechism classes. You know, there was a sign above the stove in my kitchen. I haven't thought about these things for a long time. And there was a sign above the stove that said, "Let go and let God." And, you know, at 10 years old, you can read it and you can understand it, but you don't have any depthful understanding of what it means. And there was another little sign toward the foyer of my home that said, "Grant that I may not criticize my neighbor until I've walked a mile in his shoes." There was this little wooden sign. And I share those, Mike, because those were things at my earliest age that I've carried with me. And whether it was intentional or not, my mother and father, and I should mention also, forgive me, my father was in the seminary as a teenager. My father was studying to be a priest.
Is that before he became a teacher, obviously?
Yeah. And he wasn't necessarily overly religious, but he's since passed. But as I think back over my life, if there was anyone that I could think of that had faith at work, it's Steve Evangelista, my dad. And so it's no wonder he said to me, "David, you know, when your father says you should be an altar boy, what he's saying is you're going to be an altar boy." And so you know, I had a great childhood.
Awesome. Where did you go to school?
So my elementary school was a public school. Let's hope I don't need it, Father Luke. I don't know if that was a sign. Let's hope I don't need it. But I appreciate the preemptiveness. I went to Windsor Hill Public School. And then that was my elementary school. And then I went to Cranston Johnston Catholic Regional, which was a Catholic school for junior high school. That was my first introduction to religious education beyond just your standard CCD classes. And then I went to an all-boys Catholic school, Bishop Hendricken, which was at the time, and probably still now, one of the best schools in the state of Rhode Island, where I'm from. All boys, you wear a jacket and tie every day, which is why I have to say I feel more comfortable in this than I do in jeans. No, I do. I mean, I do. I really do. It's quite comfortable. It's quite natural, which I think was the idea. A lot of kids, a lot of my friends, in other settings would say, "Gosh, you went to an all-boys school," and I have to say, Mike, I loved it. I loved the religious education. I was fascinated by the parables. I was fascinated by the Beatitudes at the very young age when Nickelodeon was just introduced to the TV. I remember my brother and I watching, we had VHS, watching Jesus of Nazareth. And I remember that being the story. There was so many other things to watch, especially now with cable. This is times when Michael Jackson was coming out with Thriller, and this was the Boston Celtics and LA Lakers rivalry, and my brother and I would just watch over and over again Jesus of Nazareth, from start to finish. And I remember we used to be really upset because, come on guys, it's time for dinner, and we didn't want to pause. So my education was a great one, and I'm very grateful to my mom and dad for supporting my education, through and through, and for encouraging me to go to the religious side. And I'm proud to say that now my son John, who's 12, goes to a school that has a faith-based education. He's now 12. And, God bless, he likes it, he's enjoying it.
When did you start enjoying going to church and being an altar boy, and how did that process evolve?
Well, I have to say, I think I understand why my mom and dad asked me to be an altar boy. When I was a kid, like a young child, they would take me to church, and I would sleep. I would literally sleep. It was just such a slow, when you're 5, 6 years old, it's tough to get into it, I'm sorry, it's because you don't really understand the metaphoric value. You haven't developed your principles and values yet, so you lack that connectivity. And so my earliest age, I used to fall asleep at church. As just the whole parish knew it, and everyone laughed, and everyone saw me. And when I was walking, I'd be like, how did you sleep?
You feel better now?
So I think in large part, my mom and dad were probably, keen to see that we're going to get this guy up and running. I enjoyed church for 3 reasons. Number one, I had a role. And later on in life, when I've had the pleasure of working for Dr. Tim Shriver, he always emphasizes that in life, whether it be volunteers or sponsors or dignitaries, give them something to do. Give them a job, give them a role, have a purpose. And so being an altar boy was one of my first purposeful roles in life. I also liked the idea that it was formal. It was ceremonial. There was something, I didn't understand all of it, but I knew that there was something much deeper there than what I was just experiencing. And then I began to connect it to watching Jesus of Nazareth. And I began to understand, Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only say the word and I shall be healed. I began to understand that the church was calling on us to be humble, but to take the invitation. And so I really enjoyed church. I don't know when I stopped being an altar boy. By the way, back in the day, Mike, you used to do weddings. They used to get paid $5, $10. And when you're 11 years old and you have an envelope with $10, and mom and dad can't tell you what to do with it, it was that was a heck of a thing. But also I think my mom and dad were happy to see that David would do extra. I didn't terribly enjoy funerals, I should mention. I consider myself a relatively happy guy. I love people.
You are, yeah. Lots of positivity, all you do.
I love people. So the funerals were kind of, but again, I think they might have actually come with $15, so that could have been an even bigger one. But no, I enjoyed church, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention Father John Lapointe, and I hope I have a chance to send him this. Mm-hmm. Father John Lapointe, who I think now lives in Florida. If he was here today, I'd look at him and say, saved my life. Father John, as we knew him, Father John used faith to kind of hold my hand, if you will, during some very turbulent years in my adolescence. And
was it a result of the divorce or something else?
Definitely the result of the divorce. Very, very complicated. Mm-hmm. Very complicated. Yeah. And it also showed me what pain was. But also I should mention that at that time, Father John Lapointe was my first teacher of many on what vulnerability is and why it's not something you run from but run to. That's not an intuitive thing when you're 14. But he was one of the people that taught me in a way that I could understand at such a young age that feeling vulnerable and feeling incomplete and feeling torn, that these are very much parts of the life of Jesus. And that if you're made in his likeness and image, then why would you not feel these things? And Father John LaPointe was a tremendously powerful figure in my early years.
What's he doing now? Is he retired? Or?
He's a retired priest. He lives in Florida.
Great to meet him. Yeah,
He
wonderful.
introduced me to Thomas Merton. He introduced me
Talked
to
to him last night.
he introduced me to a number of things. But I think most of all, from a faith perspective,
Amazing.
John LaPointe introduced me to myself.
Special Olympics has been such a big part of your life. It's becoming a big part of my life this last 2 or 3 years. But how did it all begin?
So let me thank you for Special Olympics being a part of your life, Mike. We're very grateful for that. I'll share a quick story. I know this is being live streamed, so I'll keep this very short. But the idea of Special Olympics, my father, Steve Evangelista, was tapped by the state of Rhode Island to start this new program called Special Olympics in the state of Rhode Island. But I think it's very important to set the stage. Okay, this is the mid-'70s. My father was a public school teacher, which is a good job, a secure job. He was married and had children. And Mrs. Shriver, Mrs. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the founder of Special Olympics, called the governor of Rhode Island and said, essentially, similar to the way my parents told me I'll be being an altar boy, she called this governor of Rhode Island and basically said, you'll be starting a program for our special friends. But I think it's really important for all of us to understand, now history has absolved all of those naysayers and doubters. But if you put yourself into the spectrum of 1974 or 75, Special Olympics was an incredibly audacious and borderline crazy idea. The reason I say that, Mike, is because after having studied eugenics in university for quite a bit, I think back and I say to myself, for Mrs. Eunice Kennedy Shriver to feel so much, I'm going to be balanced here, energy, and not all of it overly positive. She was quite angry at the world for what they were unwilling to give to her sister Rosemary. The idea that she would use, of course, a brilliant model of using the very non-politicized, non-confrontational sport. Healthcare can be politicized, education can be politicized, foreign policy can be politicized. Sport is still the unifier. But it was very audacious. And I remember my father telling me, David, it was very difficult at the very beginning. You go into these community centers, you go into parks and recs, you go into these companies, and they say to themselves, who's gonna bite someone? Who's gonna take a seizure? Who's gonna, the risks. And my father would always say, got it, what a guy. He would always say what Robert Kennedy said. Most people see things that are and ask why. I see things that have never been and ask why not. And that's really what Eunice was doing. She was bringing forth what her brother Robert had said to the nation.
And the question was, your father skeptic in the beginning to celebrity humor the Kennedy family, or did he buy into it immediately?
He bought into it immediately, and I have to say, Mike, and I want to be measured here, but
no, that's okay.
often much to the chagrin of the rest of the family. Keep in mind, he was a public school teacher. He had a very secure job. He's raising a family, and he gives that up to work for a startup, basically, a not-for-profit with a family that is incredibly famous and noteworthy, but with an idea that was, at the time, thought to be quite not well thought out, to put it lightly. Now again, history has 7 million athletes, 190 countries, 56 years. History has absolved the doubt. But it's important to keep in mind that when people make decisions, context is everything. And so he dove into it.
Maybe just to put it in perspective, people understand the sports is such a big part of Special Olympics. Can you quickly just summarize for the group all the other activities that Special Olympics does in education, healthy outcomes?
So Special Olympics is it's an organization, but we categorize ourselves, we define ourselves, I believe, accurately as a movement. Movements don't end. Movements don't stop at 5 p.m. and movements don't start at 9. We use the power of sport to create a holistic social and human development platform for people with intellectual disabilities. Through sport, we provide clinical screenings for individuals with intellectual disabilities. I'm very grateful to that program because that's how I met my wife. She's the optometrist from Spain that came to Alaska and was being trained to take this vision program.
I think I met in Florida. You met in Alaska?
I met in Alaska. It's funny, when you say it in Spanish, I met my wife is Basque, I met una vasca in Alaska. You know, it's always made for a fun tongue twister with my friends. That's another story, but that's another story. But we provide health screenings. Many of you may not know that when you meet an individual with intellectual disability, 1 out of 3 cannot see the finish line when they start the race. 1 out of 5 can't hear you saying hello. These are just some of the stats. And when you go further south in the world, if that's their state of vision and hearing, what's their blood pressure? What's their social protection measures or lack thereof? It's scandalous. And so Special Olympics has been such a remarkable driver of human development. We provide opportunities for children and youth with intellectual disabilities, not only to go to school, but to give the mainstream students a chance to learn from them. Because I firmly believe that the Special Olympic athletes are by far the most prolific teachers in the world. And I have 25 years of experience, limited as it may be, but I've met thousands, if not tens of thousands, of individual athletes and families, and they have a unique ability, at times very unacademic, to teach us the way John LaPointe taught me. The only comparison that I could give for people with the only comparison that I could give in terms of some collective that has taught me more than potentially Father John LaPointe in faith are the athletes of Special Olympics. But I want to share a quick anecdote, which I think is important. When my father first started Special Olympics in Rhode Island, it was a new program to the country, and Rhode Island was one of the first states. I don't remember exactly when.
The first games were in Chicago?
First games were in Chicago in 1968, which is very fitting that we're here. Special Olympics Rhode Island was one of the first U.S. states to be started. And the reason why was because Mrs. Shriver she was in Massachusetts, between Massachusetts and Washington, and Rhode Island was small enough that you could pilot programs. And if it worked in Rhode Island, then you could scale it to other places. But Rhode Island was quite contained, and Rhode Island was quite close to the network, and people would be quite willing. I remember very, very quickly, I was outside of St. Robert Bellarmine Parish in Johnston one day when my father first started the program. This had to have been very, very young because my parents were still married at the time. And I don't want to say my father was a celebrity of sorts, but he was a person of interest because he was working for Eunice Kennedy Shriver. He started an organization, but he was working with people that generally you didn't see. Again, think of context. You didn't see these individuals, not like today. And so I remember whenever he'd come out of church, all of the families of people with intellectual disabilities would kind of surround him. Not as a celebrity type, but just because he was kind of the face of this new idea that we can be seen and we can be here and we can be celebrated. And it was quite remarkable. And I remember going up to my dad once, and I said to him, Dad, you're a kid, you don't know. Thank God I think, discreet. I'll say I was discreet for the purposes of this discussion. But I asked him, I said, Dad, why is John's tongue so big? He had Down syndrome. John had Down syndrome. And his tongue was always out, and he would drool. And I remember going up to my father and saying, now keep in mind, this is a church. This is outside of church. I think back, I say, God clearly knows how to connect the dots. I said, Dad, why is John's tongue so big? And my father said, why is your hair so black? And I said, well, God made me that way. He said, exactly. And that was when I began to understand, in a very deep way, incomplete and imperfect as it was, that my father was trying to teach me something that the athletes of Special Olympics have rounded out in a way that is quite remarkable. He didn't tell me ever why he didn't know that people with Down syndrome have a slower metabolic rate, and that's why they burn calories slower. So that's why they gain weight. He didn't know that people with intellectual disabilities, namely those with autism, have a faster rate of fabricating serum in their ears, so they have hearing loss sooner. He didn't know these things. The world didn't know these things. But think of the magic that he had when he said to me, why is your hair so black? He didn't answer my question. He put it back on me to answer myself. And I think in many ways that's a big part of my faith journey. That when I ask the questions, Jesus comes back and says, maybe you can answer it yourself. And that's been scary, Mike.
Questioning intellectual disability is not to change the topic at all, but when I first heard the term, says I'm surprised that term is not being viewed as negatively, almost derogatory, and that I wonder how when they're gonna change it. And I've heard so many wonderful examples of why it actually is the appropriate term to follow up discussions. And I know you have views on that, so maybe just make a comment on.
Yeah, well, so this comes really from my studies of eugenics, and I should mention, I was just sharing with my colleague Mike Hamilton, who's with us in the audience.
Welcome, Mike.
I was at university. I went to American University in Washington, D.C. My father was adamant that I go to Washington. He always said, David, when things happen in the world, it happens first in Washington. I remember he'd always say that.
Not necessarily all good, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. But anyways, senior year in high school, my last semester, and all my friends are at parties and doing, complete decadence, as 20 or 21-year-olds do the last semester in university. And I had the brilliant idea, only to find out later that it wasn't mandatory, that I was going to have a senior thesis. I thought that as a senior in college, you had to write a senior thesis. So I asked for one. Who asks for that, Mike? I don't. Anyways, I remember I was introduced to a professor, Albert Mott, who later I learned was a legend in cross-cultural analysis. And at 21 years old, he sits me down in the library and says, I want you to write me an 80-page thesis on the study of eugenics.
Wow.
And I remember asking him, can you spell that? And I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm not ashamed to say it. Because he asked me, what are you doing this semester? And I said, I'm interning at Special Olympics. Wow. And he said, I want you to write an 80-page thesis on eugenics. Okay. I had no idea what one had to do with the other. Albert Mott changed my professional career forever, before it had even started. I learned in studying eugenics that the human condition has been so uncomfortable with this population, starting from words like mongoloid. This is just in the last 100 years. Words like mongoloid, defect, useless, retarded. Then we tried to get a bit more buttoned up, so we went with mental retardation. And then we moved over to the intellectually disabled, and then intellectual disabilities. My sense is this: number one, if you have to go through that many linguistic versions, clearly the issue is not theirs; it's yours. My nephew Dylan with Down syndrome refers to himself as Dylan. He's Dylan. There's no other label for him. He's Dylan, and I'm David, or Uncle Dave. He's one of the few that call me Dave. But what I also learned was the world has it wrong. Linguistically, and I can say this also, I mean, I luckily, through my wife, I speak Spanish. I grew up speaking some Italian. It's a linguistic misnomer. To disable something is to render it useless. You disable a light bulb. You disable a car battery. It no longer works. How is it that somebody who's rendered useless is running marathons? How is it that people who are rendered useless are doing Ironmen? How is it that people who are rendered useless have inspired the world? How is it that they can be sources of such joy and love and forgiveness and hope? And the world linguistically demeans them almost unabashedly, even in their most good-intentioned attempt. If you think of the athletes of Special Olympics and people with intellectual disabilities, the joy and the purity of thought and emotion that they give you unto itself would be remarkable. But maybe not altogether unique, because many would have that. But if you take this incredible power of forgiveness, of engagement, sometimes of affection, but also clarity of thought, and you put it into a context of a population that has been ridiculed, dehumanized, stigmatized, isolated, unfortunately trafficked, exploited, that now becomes an energy unlike anything. And that's why when people go to Special Olympics events, they go, and when they leave, they cry.
Yep.
And what is it? What is it that makes you cry? What is it that has been called out of you that you didn't hear before? And by the way, I don't know the answer to that, but I have my own opinion, but it's an opinion. And so I believe that the study of eugenics is what gave me the intellectual interest in Special Olympics. Beyond badminton, beyond football, which by the way are excellent medians for human connection, maybe the ultimate. But it gave me a feel of this was very interesting intellectually. This had historical roots. This was part of human evolution, of seeing people who are different and trying to figure out how do we accept the differences within ourselves. I'll stop there.
Amazing answer. Thank you very much. How did your faith evolve through your decades, 2.5 decades with Special Olympics?
Well, I would.
Because again, this is faith at work, and I'm going to listen to you.
I mean,
God has you in the right place.
The thing is, so first off, I guess I've tried to piece together some things here. I began work at Special Olympics in large part because my childhood at times was turbulent, but it was filled with love. Even in the most violent of storms, there's moments of calm. I love my mother and father dearly, and I was compelled at that time in my life to take forward the torch that my father had started. By the time that I was an adult, my father was no longer working for Special Olympics. But there was never a time in my life that I saw my father's eyes so bright than when he mentioned his time at Special Olympics. So viscerally, I was drawn to want to do something like that just to see what this was all about. I had no intention. In fact, I even said, about a year in, I was like, when I start learning here, I'll find another job. But I didn't understand the depth of the learning that people with intellectual disabilities could give. So my father, the fact that I tried to carry on a legacy of my dad was big in faith because my father started, in the seminary. So he would always speak about his time at the seminary and speak about the need to be disciplined and do good for others and stay true to yourself and there's man's law, but then there's God's law and things of this. Then I met my wife 2 years into my job. And you mentioned it very well, Mike, and I think anyone that knows me knows she is the love of my life. I mean, I don't want to sound overly romantic here, but if it's true that God works through people, then she's the closest to God, at least for me. She's just, and by the way, she's my wife, so all of us know that a lot goes into that, right? She reminds me of my imperfections. She reminds me of my incompleteness. But she's the most beautiful thing. But my faith has been challenged many times, Mike, in Special Olympics.
Yeah, those will be my next question, but yeah, go ahead.
Many, many times. My faith has been challenged many times. What many people see externally of Special Olympics, and this is good because this is part of how Mrs. Shriver and our chairman, Dr. Timothy Shriver, who, by the way, is just a remarkable human being, and I don't say that in a professional way only.
He did a great job a couple of years ago at this session.
He did, and it made me incredibly nervous to come and do this. And I'm glad that this is being recorded so he can hear that. What the world sees is triumph. And what the world sees is grit and courage and determination. And that's what the world should see, because that's what the population is. That's what this population offers to the world. But the plight facing this population globally is at times horrific. I remember once I went to rural Malawi, which is probably one of the poorest countries. I think it's 10th and poorest country in the world. It's in a tough neighborhood in Africa. I remember before I went, I was looking up just some stats to get a feel for where I was going. I think at the time it said, it had 21% malaria rate and, a 23% HIV rate. It was a tough country, not a very high GDP, very, very poor. But I was going to meet the head of state there because she was keen to do stuff with us, and I said, wonderful, this is an opportunity. Well, I went, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, very, very grateful. And Peter Mazunda, who was then the president of Special Olympics Malawi, took me to the Machinji district, which was about 25 miles outside of the capital, Lilongwe, but about 25,000 years outside of the capital of Lilongwe, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And I met a boy named Aaron Banda, who we had seen had been tied to a tree. He had untreated cerebral malaria. So he wasn't born with an intellectual disability. This was part of me understanding that it's not only that God made us this way, but that man can make us this way too. He had untreated cerebral malaria. And I remembered, very rural. When you got to his hut, and it was a brick hut, you can do a 360. There was nothing there. There was nothing there. Nothing. Except cassava, crop out in the field. And I remember Special Olympics Malawi had gone and literally untied him. And when I got there, we still saw the rope. Mm-hmm. And I remembered that he was crying uncontrollably and staring intently at the cassava pot. And I could only imagine that he was hungry, and that if there was food to go around, it would go to his 5 brothers and sisters well before it got to him. And I remember him looking at where Peter Mazunda is telling me and translating in Chichewa, which is the local language, this is where he was tied. And I remembered, I was envisioning him. He's there, by the way, and I was visiting him, and he was saying, David, look around you. And I couldn't help but see, Mike, that the goats were roaming free. This is a boy of 12 years old who was tied to a tree, watching the animals roam around him freely. Now, he may have had an intellectual disability, but he wasn't blind, and he wasn't deaf. I remember then, like I remember now, that was one of the first times that I significantly questioned not only the decision I made, but where's God? Where is God in all of this? Let's be real, David. This is the David trying to be a tough guy. This is the David forgetting the lessons of Father John LaPointe of running to vulnerability. Don't run from it, run to it. I was distraught. In fact, I remember calling Dr. John Dow, who's currently my immediate supervisor, but just a tremendous mentor and human being. And I remember yelling at him, crying like a baby, but yelling. I was angry. Mike, I was angry. My faith was rattled, completely rattled, maybe even fractured.
So what happened?
He said, don't you think there was a reason why you went? What has Aaron taught you? That's the one thing John Dow asked me, and I didn't like hearing it. It felt too soft. He still does this, by the way. He's a remarkable teacher because he makes you make the decision. But he just puts you in the right frame of mind. What do you think Aaron taught you? And I didn't want to hear that. I thought the world had showed me that it was unjust, that it was a terribly inequitable place. And God darn it, how can we send people to the moon and we can't take care of Aaron Bonda? And what John Dow taught me and what my faith journey has taught me was Aaron Bonda was perhaps one of the most powerful professors. That he showed me, Lord, I am not worthy to receive you. But only say the word, and I shall be healed. But that healing is doing. That healing is giving. That healing is fighting. Not the violent fight. Not the violent fight. The fight from the heart. The fight for dignity. And the beauty of Special Olympics is we fight that fight, not with sharp words, not with toxicity, not with violent mobilizations. We fight it with skis and tennis rackets and basketballs. And you know what, Mike? It works. It works. Aaron Bonda is in a school. Aaron Bonda belongs to a soccer team. Aaron Bonda's family were invited to see their son in a different way.
Was he at Berlin?
No, he wasn't. I don't know if he would be able to, but I can tell you.
The last World Games were in Berlin 2 years ago. That's
the World
my
Games.
first one, yeah.
But Aaron Bonda, and anyone in Special Olympics International knows Aaron Bonda. But Aaron Bonda, for me, is by far one of the strongest professors, as unacademic as it comes. But I learned more from meeting Aaron Bonda in 20 minutes. By the way, a year later, I brought Dr. Timothy Schreiber to meet Aaron Bonda. And that was, for me, one of the highlights of my career. And it also showed me that at the highest levels of our organization, and we will be in rural Malawi, caring for those who need it most.
Obviously not doing a good job. I have 6 more questions, and we're not going to finish them all. We always ask, you're going to get some really great questions from this group as well, but maybe just last one, and I'm be interested, you and I have not rehearsed this. Your impression from Dr. Schreiber's, from Tim's talk at the Berlin opening games. What really struck you, the message he gave to the world in both the opening and his closing comments?
Well, first off, for us as a movement, Berlin was a remarkable place because it was a place that has become unified. Special Olympics uses the term unified as its brand name for inclusive. We have unified sports, we have unified schools, we try to promote unified leadership. All of that's inclusive. So Berlin for us as a movement was very, very important. I'd imagine for Tim and his family, Berlin was also a very nostalgic place for human history. And for, but I remember one of the biggest messages that Tim was sharing during the games, of all the different speeches and all the different remarks that he made. He called upon us to look around. The last time that an Olympic event was held in this stadium, this population was
1936, yep.
this population was not in the center of the stadium. They were in other places. And I won't go further in a place of faith. But he looked at the world and said, the world can change. People can change. If we fight the right way enough, and we call out the best in people, not the worst in people, but we call out the best in people, and you do it enough and enough, and you stay persistent, and you don't let the weight of the world bear you down, and it will. But you've got to keep going. And how do we know that? Because the athletes ask us to. The world can change. And I'll never forget looking around saying, I tried to close my eyes because I'm a pretty nostalgic guy. I tried to close my eyes and think of this place in 1936 and then open my eyes and, wow.
Yeah, the juxtaposition that Tim was saying is that obviously Hitler giving the opening speech, 1936, the same stadium, the supreme race, and then everybody else. And then obviously a number of decades later, you have, I think, 18,000 German volunteers. Robbie and I had an engineer from Google. She'd taken an unpaid week off from Google to really show board members around, to say, look what's possible. I mean, it did not happen as fast as it could and should have. So there's a wonderful juxtaposition that Tim was using. So anyway, questions from this group? Rick, yeah, wow. Maybe you were not first, I'm surprised.
As you probably know,
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah,
okay. The Lions, two of the main pillars are sight and sound. Another one is disaster relief. Could you say more about Special Olympics involvement with the Lions?
Sure. I'm happy to because it has a lot to do with my faith journey, if you will. Special Olympics and Lions Clubs International started a global partnership when, in the year 2001. I was with the organization. I was with Special Olympics for probably 7 minutes, as if to say I had just started. And it was a relationship that I was asked to help manage from work. Lions Clubs International is probably by far the most impressive organization because you have roughly 1.5 million people around the world who pay to help people. Think of the concept. Now, I understand originally it was kind of like these were little mini chambers of commerce. My grandfather, post-World War II, belonged to a Lions Club. He was a barber. My other grandfather, post-World War II, belonged to a Lions Club. He was an insurance salesman. I get it. But they were called to do things for others and pay dues to do it. Pretty remarkable concept in a world that is completely pixelized now. Lions Clubs came on board with Special Olympics because we had a vision program. I mentioned earlier how I met my wife. And they wanted to take that program globally because it was so aligned well with their Helen Keller asking Lions Clubs to be the Knights of the Blind. And they provided us not only with tremendous and generous financial support, but also volunteers to help us do it. That blossomed into a platform that we now call Mission Inclusion, where Lions Clubs International and hundreds of thousands of volunteers every year provide support to getting our athletes on the field with youth, providing support to refugees, providing family education to families of children with intellectual disabilities in some of the poorest countries on earth, and also some of the richest. Our Opening Eyes program, our Vision program, but more importantly, they have reinforced for Special Olympics the relationship that service has with inclusion. And what I've realized is you cannot serve unless you include. And really inclusion is an act of service. But one thing I learned, which was a very important point, is when you include someone, there's a part of you that's included too. It's not altruistic. It's not this idea of we're including, come and be with all of us. There's a part of you that gets included in that as well. It's an odd and strong feeling. Lions Clubs International have inspired me. They've inspired many others. I'm very happy to belong to a Lions Club since the year 2000. I'm a progressive Melvin Jones Fellow, for whatever that, what that means. I give to the Lions Club's International Foundation, which is an incredibly strong foundation. And Lions Clubs are probably I don't want to, I have to be careful here because I don't know the specifics as such, but they're one of the largest and longest standing global partners of Special Olympics.
Tom?
First, thank you so much. And, your message today, I've been to many of these, and it's probably the most impactful that I've been to.
Thank you.
My question kind of turns the clock way back. The Rosemary Kennedy, they kind of institutionalized her at a young age. And then Maria Shriver was her sister, right?
Eunice Shriver.
Shriver was her sister. And it's just kind of interesting. She probably had some friction within the family, from a standpoint. She was probably Rosemary's best friend and really probably saw the light, at way back when. And, it's just kind of interesting how this whole thing, how this all started, probably with Rosemary and, being in the family. And it just, just maybe some insights on that.
Well, I want to be careful to not go too deep into a family that's not my own,
Right.
as such. But I can say that Dr. Timothy Shriver is somebody who I have spent a great deal of time with, and I find every moment I have valuable, not only from a work perspective. Had the chance
Values, faith,
had the chance to pray with him and to discuss politics and to discuss life and marriage and children and of course Special Olympics and the business. What I know, a lot of that. What I know is that Eunice Shriver was very, very upset that everything that Jack, there was always a lot for Jack, and there was always a lot for Bobby, there was always a lot for Teddy. There was nothing for her sister Rosemary. And I would imagine, and this is what I understand also from my father, who knew Rose Kennedy well, that Eunice Kennedy was incredibly moved by the sadness that she would see on her mother's face when she would call and, can my daughter Rosemary go to this camp? No, we don't have camps for people like your daughter. And that's why I tell people Special Olympics is a remarkable, remarkable movement, powerful. It works. I mean, really, it works. If we were a for-profit business, look at the numbers, and look at the prolific expansion, and look at the adhesiveness and it goes viral. But it came from a place of, I'll be measured here, frustration, if not, frustration. And I think that's why Tim Shriver said in an interview with Oprah Winfrey some years back, pain, you have a choice with pain. This comes from his book, Fully Alive, Dr. Tim Shriver's book, Fully Alive. When pain is something that you can either transform or transmit. And they have two drastically different results in life. And by the grace of God, and it's no wonder, because Eunice Kennedy Shriver had faith very at the core of her being, she took that pain and transformed it. She didn't transmit it, she transformed it. At least that's what I understand, that's what I've done my life experience. And look at the course of human history since then. So we all have a choice. We're all going to feel pain. The storms are going to come. And what I recognize from the athletes of Special Olympics is, please do the world a favor and ourselves a favor, transform that into something that we can make good. And I think that's the legacy, the vast legacy of Eunice Kennedy Shriver.
A little plug for my friend Harry Kramer. He just wrote a book about legacy. And one of those things really is that motivation that people start various initiatives, and one of those is from tragic events. To be able to use that, this was from a very different, but this is one perfect example of taking tragedy. Maybe there was God's intention, if you will, to be using some of those occasions to really drive the outcomes that God really wants us to have. Mimi, Deva, we cannot have a session without Mimi asking a great question, so this is the last question for today.
I just echo so many of the questions and the feelings in this audience, particularly running towards your vulnerabilities and what that means to do that, because it gives us as individuals agency to really think about our lives differently. And so I don't really have a question, because you have demonstrated that sense of running towards vulnerability in a way that is very, very inspirational, and I thank you.
Well, thank you.
We're going to finish with a prayer, but before that, let's just say thank you very much, David. You were just amazing. I know how much you've thought about this. I believe that your investment has been paid dearly, mostly for yourself, but as you can tell from the reaction from these groups, I did want to say just thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you for being David Evangelista.
Wow. I thank you very much. Thank you.
We always finish with a prayer.
Great.
Let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I
Awesome.